I'm going to be talking about a variety of things today. The central theme, of course, is going to be archery, but I've got a rather circuitous route to get there before we begin, if you'll indulge me for a moment or so. And I think this needs to be in the foreground.
Yes, I will get that to the right place.
Well, Nuristan, for those of you who don't know where it is located on the eastern border of Afghanistan, and it's a place really like no other in Afghanistan. It was the last part of the country to be converted to Islam by Abdur Rahman Khan in 1896. And the reason that it was the last part of the country, one of them, to be converted, was because of its very remote and rugged geography, and because of the fierce independence of the communities that lived there. What's really astonishing is that for almost 1,000 years, Nuristan resisted the spread of Islam across the region. So for scholars, ethnographers, anthropologists, historians, Nuristan is a really exciting opportunity to reach back through time and take a glimpse at, or have a glimpse at, the sort of Indo-Iranian, Indo-Aryan cultures that used to flourish in the region before the spread of Islam. Now, we have no written records. I can change it, brilliant. Here we are, located in the east, as I said. Rugged geography. It's very unusual in Afghanistan. It's very forested, thickly forested everywhere, steep, narrow valleys, very difficult to conquer. So Alexander the Great never really got a toehold in here. Timur Shah never could, Soviets never did, and the recent sort of Western coalition never really maintained much control over it now. So much remains to be seen whether the Taliban can keep control of things going forward. Now, with the Taliban takeover in 2021, last August, there's an opportunity to travel to places like Nuristan that have hitherto been completely inaccessible. So for more or less 40 years, and I know there are some exceptions, probably listening online as well, for more or less 40 years, traveling to Nuristan has been very, very difficult indeed. And every time the spotlight of research has fallen on Nuristan, there is less and less of this rich material culture present. It's being destroyed, lost through neglect, damage, whatever. And here is, on the next slide, some of that wonderful rich material cultural heritage. So we have some extraordinary woodworking, sculptures and carvings that used to adorn all of or many of the houses of the wealthier inhabitants of the region. Absolutely wonderful examples. The houses themselves, the architecture is quite extraordinary. Because of the abundance of wood, of course, they can use it as a building material freely, and it's used in this construction you can see here, the sort of lattice work of logs with stones in between is earthquake resistant, so they're very strong, very resistant. Many of these buildings are about 100 years old, if not older. Wonderful furniture carving as well. Chairs as well come from Nuristan in particular. That's an unusual feature in a country where most people tend to sit on the floor traditionally. There's basket weaving, there's stone carving, there's folk songs, there's dancing, there's costume. There's a whole rich culture in Nuristan, including archery, which I will come to momentarily. Here are some of the famous statues from Nuristan celebrating gods and ancestors, fertility images. All of these pre-Islamic images, sculptures, iconography, all of this since 1896 has been steadily destroyed and removed. This example here on the left is in the Kabul Museum, and when I was there in August, all of these displays had now been removed from the museum. I think they are somewhere in storage safely, I understand. But again, there's sort of a foresight perhaps into the Taliban's attitude towards this type of thing. And much of this stuff is getting left behind and neglected as well. So here is a great example of a beautiful carved pillar that no longer has a place architecturally or artistically. It is just left on the floor, lying around and forms a little step there for people to walk around the village. So the cultural heritage in Nuristan is wonderfully rich, but it's just gradually getting lost. A great example of that is one chap I met had been working with an anthropologist back, I think, in the 70s, and so was very clued up on cultural heritage in the region. And I was asking him about, is there something old and interesting I can see here? And after a bit of discussion, he said, yes, there is. There's this thing called Minjan. I said, what's Minjan? And he said, well, it's a sacrificial rock, and it's just in this next village. And, it was where we used to have our most important ceremonies. And I said, please take me there. It'd be wonderful to see this. And he said, well, you can't. Why not? Because I blew it up. You blew it up. Yes, I blew it up. And he said he had to blow it up to make a drain, of all things, an irrigation ditch, which I can show you rather excitingly on the next slide. Here we are. Here's the sacred sacrificial rock of Munjan at the bottom of a drainage ditch. So it's tremendously sad. But Nuristan today is one of the poorest provinces in Afghanistan. One of the consequences of being so remote and being such an intense a location of such intense conflict is that a lot of NGOs, with a few exceptions, haven't been working in Nuristan. So the least amount of money from all the aid that went into Afghanistan over the last 20 years, the least amount of that really went to Nuristan. So very little paved road across the province. I mean, a couple of kilometers tops, a few health clinics, very few schools, no large-scale development programs, the likes of which we see in other parts of Afghanistan. And one of the criticisms of sort of cultural heritage programs is, in a context like this, what right do we have to say that cultural heritage should be prioritized, that cash should go towards cultural heritage programs and conservation programs rather than traditional development programming? And I think there are really 3 points that we sort of have to say about that. The first is that we don't see this as a zero-sum game. So in a context where you've got virtually no cash flowing into Nuristan, any money that you can bring into the province through project work, be that cultural documentation, training local community members to take part in cultural surveys, any work of that nature is better than no work at all. Secondly, we're only pursuing grant funding that's specifically allocated for cultural funds. So we're not competing with education NGOs, healthcare NGOs, and so on for their limited resources. There are funds set aside specifically for heritage conservation work. And that's what we want to get hold of in order to do some more project work in Nuristan. And I'll speak a little bit more about what that looks like later. And thirdly, of course, our intent in doing work on Nuristan is to raise the profile of Nuristan, put it on the radar of other NGOs, funders and donors working on Afghanistan. So they might not think of Nuristan as a priority province because they've got such well-established programs in other parts of the country. But if we can, just through doing talks like this and other things, somehow elevate the profile of Nuristan internally and get more people thinking about it, we see that as an adequate justification for pursuing cultural programs in the region. And as a sort of a tangent to all of this, I mentioned archery earlier. This is something I've been rather obsessed about for most of my life, including my adult life. And so there's a real convergence here of personal interest and professional interest. And as I was doing the preparation for this trip, I discovered that there was an archery tournament taking place in one of the provinces, or rather one of the valleys in Nuristan. And I thought, well, this is too good an opportunity to pass by. I want to do some cultural work. I want to do some documentation of heritage. I want to make the case that it's important we invest money in Nuristan and protect this heritage before it's lost forever. But I also want to go and shoot bows and arrows because I think it needs no further justification than that. So I made a bow and arrows that could collapse. I was very proud of my design, so proud of the fact that there are 3 images of it you can see here on the screen. And you could pull the handle apart and put it in a tube and put it on the aeroplane and put some arrows in it and take it out. And I thought I'd be the flower of English archery, competing against the flowers of Nuristan and see how I'd get on. And I thought I'd do rather well. First impressions of Kabul were quite remarkable. This is the US Embassy, or this was the entrance to the US Embassy, where now you can buy Taliban flags, and the Taliban have obviously put a big flag up there as well, just demarcating their territory. A lot of the security infrastructure in Kabul, many of the blast barriers that were there, there's a lot less of that now than there used to be. It feels a much more accessible place. There's a lot less traffic on the streets as well, fewer armored vehicles, fewer guns on show. So as soon as you get off the airport, there's definitely a greater sense of calm than there had been in the past. Go back to the previous one. Permission letters in Kabul were essential. I had a lot of support from a couple of key colleagues, Dr. Bastian Brusikos, who had done some groundwork on this before when he actually visited Nuristan a month or two before me. And the Turquoise Mountain Foundation are definitely getting a shout out here as well for their support in this as well. But we went directly to the deputy minister. Trying to get any permissions to travel around Afghanistan previously was always fraught with difficulty because the bureaucracy was so fiendishly complicated. Here, after a bit of bouncing around amongst low-level bureaucrats, we decided to make a beeline for a deputy minister who granted us an audience very quickly and very kindly gave us permission in very short order. That was a surreal experience because there he was, very much a sort of, as you would expect from a Taliban minister, big black beard, bright white shalwar kameez, picking through his prayer beads as he was sort of talking to me. But he was telling me about how important cultural heritage was in Afghanistan, that we are a pluralistic society, that my word, we are a diverse society, I think, of many different traditions and cultures. And there was, I mean, I couldn't make this up. Over his shoulder, there was a display cabinet, and in it there was a book, on the front cover of which was the hollowed out Buddha statue niche that obviously his government 20 years before had blown up. Without a hint of irony, he was telling me how important cultural heritage was and how important it was for foreigners like you, Jonathan, to be coming here and doing these things. And of course, I'm very alive to the fact that it's very much in their favor for someone like me to come to Afghanistan and to say, well, it's wonderfully safe and secure and so on and so forth. The Taliban want to show what a legitimate government they are, that they are in control of the country and that they are a legitimate government. But anyway, with the permission letter secured, we also recorded his voice saying, I give permission to these people. It's a wonderful bit of foresight by my fixer. I give permission to these people to travel across Nuristan. Please got them every help you can. As we went through the sort of hierarchy from Kabul to district, to sort of provincial to district to local village level commanders, we'd whip out the letter and then subsequently, which would sort of be read in various different directions, and then pull out the sound of recording of the minister. And we had not one problem anywhere we went. It was extraordinary. The red carpet was truly rolled out for us. In a few instances, we had a few guards sort of for our protection pushed onto us. We lost them in short order. They were rather useless and not very much help at all. But other than that, we weren't really bothered at all. It was quite extraordinary. So onto the archery. I've completely lost my place now in the talk here. But onto the archery. This is the village of Bagro Matal, and it's located not far from a place where 100 years ago, an Englishman called George Robertson visited. He spent a year living in Kamdesh village. I'll come back to George Robertson later. Bagro Matal, Wilfred Thesiger came here in 1952 or 1956 and wrote a book about it. So there's a lot of history and beautiful images that he recorded from that time that you can see if you like. But here we are in Bagro Matal at the location of the archery tournament. Now, I warned you that I was quite passionate about archery, so I'm afraid you're going to have to indulge me on a few things here. The archery is terrific. So you shoot over a range of 100 meters. And at each end of the range, you have a little stick, and you can just about see the thing here, this little stick, and then the other one would sort of be around here if the perspective picture allows. And you have 2 arrows, each person has 2 arrows, and you shoot 1 arrow from one end of the range and your other arrow from the other end of the range. And you have 2 teams, each team is, I think it's 12 people, there were 18 teams in total competing. And that has the rather terrifying effect of once the first person shoots his arrow at a clear target like this, he goes to the other end and stands by the target. So by the time the last person's shooting, you've got 23 people, just the competitors, forget the spectators, 23 people crowding around that little stick of a target. And there's definitely no health and safety here. So you're often firing into a crowd of people, which is a terrifying prospect. But I think what would be better than showing you all of these images would be to play a short video. Michael, I wonder whether you need to hit the space bar for this one. It wasn't tremendously well edited, but I hope that gives a sense of what it's like. And you might have noticed in those last images the rather alarming practice of crouching down by the target, massively unhelpfully, by the way, as it turned out later, but crouching down by the target and flashing a mobile phone, waving a hat, flashing a mirror or something to attract the attention of your teammate to the target that you're shooting at. And every now and again, of course, it would work. Here they are doing it. Here's a particularly bright fellow sitting directly behind the target, not even to the side of the thing. But it did work. Every now and again, there was a hit on the target. And this is 100 meters. So this is no mean feat whatsoever. What was fun to watch, of course, was, as I mentioned before, when you had your sort of 24 people crowded around the target, there would be children running between your feet here, there, and everywhere. There'd be other spectators crowding in to see, where the arrow is going to come. So everyone sort of crowds in as the shooter's over there aiming at the target, and everyone crowds in closer and closer to see where the arrow comes. Up it goes. And by the time it reaches its apex, it's almost too late to dodge out of the way. So then everybody jumps out of the way, scatters immediately as the arrow lands. Very, very good fun to watch, very exhilarating. And these things, the videos don't do it justice, but they really zip along. And if you think that that's about an inch and a half of dry wood that an arrow has just split at a range of 100 meters, I think that sort of tells you what you need to know about if it got you in the leg or in the arm. And apparently people do get killed every once in a while. Now, oh, and sorry, when you don't hit the target, there's always an almighty debate as to whose shot was the closest. So you might, if you imagine a stick in the ground here, and if your arrow passed within millimeters of the top of the stick, but sticks in the bank 2 meters behind, and another arrow lands in front of the target, who's the winner there? And there were endless protracted debates about who the winners were. But what's really wonderful about all of the archery here is that it hasn't changed very much, if at all, in about 100 years. So I mentioned George, 130 years. I mentioned George Robertson earlier, who was in Kamdesh village in 1890 to 1891. And though he didn't write much about the archery, we have some wonderful drawings that were based on photographs. And you can see very clearly, and from his written descriptions, that there's very little difference now between what they were shooting and then. So the bows themselves are quite short. They're about sort of this height. They're straight-limbed, so they're not recurved in the way that you might find from neighboring countries. So the sort of bows that come from the steppes to the north, with the sort of the Mongol armies and so on, are those very famous sort of recurved horse bows, designed to be shot from the back of a horse, made of sort of sinew, horn, bone, and so on. And they're not like similar bows to that come from the Persian Empire to the east, to other parts, to the west, from other parts of Afghanistan as well. So they're quite interestingly unique if you're into your bows and arrows. In terms of a draw weight, that's the power it takes, the strength it takes to pull the bows back. They're anywhere between about 40 and 60 pounds at the top, which is more than enough to send an arrow with pretty frightening speed and power into whatever you're shooting at. They used to be used a lot for warfare. So they used to be used for shooting other people. Village raiding was endemic, conflict was endemic for a very long time. This was the principal weapon, and they are perfectly calibrated to the environment. They're made of a single piece of wood, so you don't have any of the worries about temperature fluctuations that you get here. You know, very hot in summer, very cold in the winter. You don't have any worries about moisture. All of these things are problematic when you start creating laminated bows from different composite materials. So it's very easy, very quick, very basic to make, and I'll talk a little bit about the making in a moment. In the arrows, we've got some here. The arrows are unfletched. That means they don't have any feathers on them. They're just a straight piece of bamboo with a whopping great big point at the end. That's about 1.5 inches long, and then it goes back into the arrow shaft itself by another 1.5 inches. So it's a heavy, heavy, heavy metal head, and that allows the arrow, without any flights on it, to fly in a very straight line. I mentioned before I brought a bow and arrow out myself. And what you can't quite see in this image, because of the zoom stuff at the top, is the look of disgust on their faces as they hold my arrows and inspect them. Everything I made was treated with utter contempt. And I thought what I had made was terrific, right? I thought, well, I know that there's going to be all of this sort of moisture differential. I know I'm going to be on an airplane and this, that, and the other. I thought, I'll just make it out of a single piece of wood. I'll make it collapsible. They'll think it's brilliant, and it will be brilliant, and it will be designed to shoot very fast, but not very powerfully. And all of these things will be perfect for the environment. But I really should have known better. In a country that sort of tends to admire big, powerful, strong things, big appetites, big guns, big vehicles, and so on, my bow that was quite feeble by comparison was roundly ridiculed. And the arrows as well, again, I thought they'd be brilliant. I'd have a competitive advantage here. Mine had feathers on them. I'm not a bad shot. I can probably do quite well here. Of course, the second they missed the target, hit off the rock, they exploded into 1,000 pieces. They're made of cedar, not made of bamboo. So they had none of that kind of resilience and toughness to the environment whatsoever. And the worst thing, the thing that they hated the most, was at the tip of the arrows. They're broken here in this image, but on the tip of the arrows, knowing that they were shooting in, or we would be shooting in, a context where there are children running about, I thought, well, I'm going to put big rubber blunt points on the end, reenactment points. So if you do hit somebody, it's going to hurt a little bit. My goodness me, was that a big error. That was the feeblest thing they had ever seen. They hated them and didn't cease to tease me for what a terrible decision that was. And it was. I mean, my stuff was crap, didn't work very well, couldn't shoot as well as anybody else. While they were shooting almost flat at 100 meters, I was aiming right up into the sky just to get my arrows to travel that far. Now here's a quick short about making a bow. Again, just sort of to develop that idea a little bit more in terms of the expedient, the perfectly calibrated nature of these bows. I mean, you can go up into the mountain. I think the bows were willow, so they cut the wood at high altitude, which is something we tend to do here with the bow wood that we use, because you have tight growth rings, which makes for a very dense, heavy piece of wood that can be then refined to quite narrow proportions and blah, blah, blah. And they're made very quickly. It takes an hour or so to make the bows. And if they break and can be replaced quite easily. The people that do much of the making are an underclass in Nuristan, a historical underclass called the Barry. And they would do all of the carving and the buildings and so on historically. And they still live in quite segregated communities within the villages in Nuristan, with a couple of exceptions. If we've got time, I can talk a bit more about that. So that's just a sort of an interesting little bit there about the bow making itself. And because my bow was so terrible, I had to go and make one myself out of the local woods in the local design, made a complete spectacle of myself. But the result was significantly better. My arrows would travel the distance quite well. And they asked me, you know, would you come and join a team? And I thought, well, this would be a wonderful thing to do. Let me have a few more practice shots. I'd get involved, and they sort of indulged me while they were sort of having a competition. And they took it very seriously, I should say. This wasn't a sort of a casual, let's do some archery. You know, as we were driving around the province elsewhere, we saw people coming together and making the long trek into Bargamatal to take part in the competition. So I felt very privileged to be asked to join one of their teams, and I didn't want to show myself up or show England up in a bad light. So we did lots of shooting, and yeah, it was terrifying because, of course, you saw those children in the videos before running across the pitch, the range as you're shooting, sitting by the target as you're shooting, plus all of the other people as well. But then even has anyone seen Carry On Up the Khyber? That scene where I think of the British Embassy siege, we've got, in a sort of complete reversal here, we've got sort of local community elders sitting in the middle of the range. I mean, this isn't the side, this is the strip of grass that runs between the two targets. They're sitting, having a lovely old time, having a lovely old chat as the arrows zip over their heads, completely unperturbed. Wonderful. But it did also mean that if you had any slight wobble in your aiming, you know, at 30 meters, that might be fine. But at 100 meters, any slight wobble is a huge deviation from the target. And if you've got as many people as this crowded around the target, and you've got to get a stick that's sort of down the middle of this alleyway, you know, chances of hitting somebody are pretty high. And I have to say, I'm not ashamed to admit that I thought better of it. And I had a couple of wild shots where my arrows were perilously close to a couple of sheep. And I thought that's probably as good as it's going to get for me. That, and I discovered that my place on a team would have cost somebody else their place. As I said, they took it quite seriously. There were 12 people per team. So I then made a complete nuisance of myself for the next few days, documenting as much, taking photographs of as much stuff as I possibly could, asking people as much as I could about the archery. And it's wonderful because my diary is quite a lot worse than I pretend it is. And so actually having this common language of archery equipment, bows and arrows, was wonderful because I didn't need very much language to be able to talk and ask questions about all of these things. You can see some finger guards here that protect your fingers from the whip of the bowstring as it draws across your fingers. Then the arm guards as well, and a variety of different ingenious things that they came up with to protect their forearms from the passage of the bowstring. And I just thought it was wonderful. And the great thing about all of these things is that it's all made locally. Nothing's imported. All of the finger guards, the arm guards, the bows, the arrows, the arrowheads, the strings, everything is made locally, which is quite unusual. There are places like Bhutan where archery is the national sport, and very often you'll see, you know, composite modern bows that have been imported for the shooting, which is fine. But this just has the edge, I think, if you're an archery purist. And then something that was terrific as well were these stone bows. So this was something that was documented quite a lot historically. Nobody was doing it that I saw when we were there, and so I encouraged the local bow maker to make me one. The bow itself is identical to the bows that you normally use, but the string configuration is brilliant. You basically have it's a continual loop of string with a stick at the top to separate the string and a pouch by the fingers, and you put the stone in. And it's quite counterintuitive because you'd think that as you draw the pouch back and let go, it would shoot into the back of your hand, which of course is exactly what I did when he gave it to me to try out. But there's a very nifty technique of being able, if you whip your hand to the side and the stone comes shooting out. And I think this might even be a video if you're allowed. Yeah. I mean, it looks unspectacular, but it's actually quite brilliant. And this would have been used a lot by children for shooting birds, for hunting historically. I think it's terrific. You can hear my excitement anyway in the video. Now, archery, I want to sort of bring to a close, so we've got time for a good conversation. I'm very aware of the time here. But archery is one of the sort of many items of cultural heritage in Nuristan that is very under-documented. We do have these accounts, as I mentioned before, from starting in sort of 1896 onwards, but they are often quite specialist, quite focused, and there is such a diversity and depth of heritage in Nuristan that it's impossible, with those few brief moments of opportunity to do any research, it's impossible to have captured the breadth of that. So I think there's really an urgent need now with this window of opportunity to go to Nuristan to document as much as humanly possible before it's all lost. And in a sort of rather strange bit of irony, this morning I was reading something about a cultural heritage program in Kabul that now has had its funding withdrawn. And this was a project that was about restoring the arms manufacturing, the arms factories that supplied Abdul Rahman Khan's army, who did the original sort of cultural cleansing in Nuristan in 1896. His factories, which are beautiful historic sites in Kabul, are no longer being funded for cultural protection, so they're now crumbling back into the dirt. So there's a nice, lovely piece of sort of historic karma, if you like, rather unfortunate one. But anyway, the sort of the passing message here is now is definitely not the time to step away from Afghanistan. Definitely not the time to step away from cultural funding. And so I think I'll pause there and hand over to anybody for questions.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Fascinating talk. My question is, aside from the sort of ethnographic, anthropological rationale for documenting the heritage in question, could you speak a little bit about what the people in Nuristan think about the importance of their cultural heritage, for example, towards their cultural identity, and how do they, particularly around archery, is it considered a sport in the way that we think about sport, or is it somehow tied up in their own sense of self and the identity of the province and the community at large?
So it's a great question, thank you. Well, I'll start with the anecdote of my fixer, who was a superb and very capable and very educated Nuristani, and he viewed these things as, or archery specifically, as, I think he used the F word and said that these effing things are for children, and he was obviously wrong because there were so many people engaged in it. I mean, archery specifically is akin to maybe boule or pétanque or something like that in France. I mean, it's the thing that people in the village will do to relax and unwind at the end of the day. But the question of, I think, how people feel about their culture is a very difficult question to answer, because on the one hand there's this. There's a great pride in this sense of who we are within Nuristan. So this the idea of a Nuristani identity might be very different from the concept of a Waigali identity or an Ashkun Kasi identity or somebody from the Bashkul Valley. There are very different identities within Nuristan, and I think people think about I suspect people think about their culture and how important it is in very, very different ways. And there will be people who might think of these things as being rather old-fashioned, not very interesting, not very exciting, rather dated. And there are those I met who were very passionate about it. I met a couple of people from the local governments in Kamdesh and Baghamasan in particular, who were very well informed about these things. And in fact, they had a whole load of pictures from George Robertson's book that they still could identify in terms of places who lived in there. The families that were talked about in these books are still very well known in the area. For them, it was very much part of who they were and something they were very proud of. But then, as I mentioned before, for very many other people, and that image of the carved pillar just buried in the dirt, illustrated. I mean, if it doesn't serve a purpose, and given all the other pressures and problems we're facing today, is this as much a priority as wood carving any longer? I think there's sort of a nuanced point to be made there.
Can I take a question from online? It's a much more specific one. Can you describe the bowstrings that are used?
Yes. Well, I asked my bowmaker to to describe how the bowstrings were made. He said, well, you know, we go up into the goat pens and we find our long-haired goats, and we pluck the finest hair from the goat, and we twist it into what we might call a Flemish twist here, where you sort of weave it and twist it and weave it and twist it into a bundle of threads. And I said, would you go and make me one? And he said, yes, of course I will. And off he went, and he bought a bit of nylon thread and tied it into a loop and put it on my bow. So, you know, there's a lot of the bowstrings were just paracord basically, but they would have been made out of goat hair, allegedly.
Yeah, please.
Yes, I was wondering if you could say a bit about the economy. What do they live on? Are they herders, pastoralists, or what?
It depends on which bit of Nuristan. And historically, it would have been a combination of sort of agriculture and pastoralism. But now, I mean, unemployment is staggering. I think that the departure of the war economy and the development economy, even though it had been pretty light touch in Nuristan to date anyway, the departure of those things, I think, has left many people completely without work. My fixer being a great example of somebody, you know, fluent in a variety of different languages, wonderfully capable, had worked with NGO charities and non-government organizations before, but was just struggling to make ends meet. And so, yeah, it's very sad. Very sad.
David, Adrian, and the gentleman in the corner, in that order.
I'm interested in the comparison with Bhutan, where archery is the national sport and tremendously active. And I wondered if there's ever been any comparison between Bhutanese and Nuristan archery, but also whether there are lessons to be learned from how Bhutan has promoted its archery. They've gone to the Olympics and everything else as a way in which, in promoting that cultural heritage in Nuristan, one could bring some of the lessons learned from Bhutan into there to make it something which was actually a growth industry rather than a dying activity.
Yeah, I think that'd be a brilliant idea. I'm probably the worst person to do that because for me, it just seems like such an obvious sell. But I think there would be, you know, probably quite some mileage in that idea for sure. As far as I'm aware, I don't think there's been any scholarship on comparison between Bhutanese and Nuristani archery. And I don't think, in fact, there's been much, if any, research specifically into Nuristani archery itself. You know, I think it's tempting. Others have done it with things like single-stringed harps in Nuristan. It's tempting to sort of take these artifacts and sort of point to other bits on the map and say, these things are similar, therefore there could be an intriguing connection. Maybe this tells us something about where the Nuristanis came from. And that's a very contentious point, or rather a much debated point. And I think with the archery specifically, I mean, my feeling is probably that they're the product of just expedience more than a particular cultural influence from somewhere else. But very interesting point about a comparison with Bhutan.
A comment and a question, if I may. And the architecture of the houses and the small forts that you illustrated very nicely, and it is very typical for that part of the world and right across into the Western Himalayas as well, with this balance between interlocking logs and stones so that things can wobble with the earthquakes. So I think at that point, the sort of that concept of architecture is well recorded elsewhere, which is a good thing. Now, there have been in parts of Afghanistan, certainly in the south, NGOs providing work for restoration. I think some of the stupas further down in the south, which the locals, okay, this is 5 years ago, so different political times, you know, locals accepted the idea that they could develop their own skills that were required to restore these ancient artifacts. Is that sort of thing actually, do you think that would be feasible in Nuristan? Is the local populace be open to that sort of training, albeit that they're restoring things that they don't necessarily see intrinsic value in?
Yeah, and I think the wonderful thing about this working with cultural heritage is that the balance is sort of flipped the other way, in that there's a knowledge and a skill set that they, local communities, have that we foreigners don't, and the trading sort of works in the other direction, if you like. There's more to be learned from them about their cultural and sort of architectural techniques than otherwise. But I think it's a good point, and I think there'd be a huge appetite for this kind of thing. When I was there, the Danish Refugee Council were just doing some preliminary sort of feasibility for building new homes. And one of the things they had said was that actually some of the new things that are being built with concrete, they fall apart and they collapse. Many others are being built in the traditional style, albeit with modern materials, and that's a wonderful thing. But they were there looking at ways in which they could use local knowledge to build more shelters for people elsewhere in the province. So it's just a lovely example, I think, of that completely different relationship between foreigners and local communities.
And yeah,
in receiving permission from the deputy minister for your trip, was there an expectation to share or report back on some of your findings with him? And to the extent that there was, do you have any idea of what he or your department would do with that information?
No, there wasn't. I think that my impression was that we want to convey the image of being in control, and therefore, if we can roll out the red carpet for you, we perhaps there's an expectation there that I'll do things like this where I say, well, how wonderful and safe it is. And it's hard to reconcile those meetings that I had with images that friends and colleagues send me today of people being beaten with sticks or stoned to death. And so those things, it's hard to verify the footage, but I think it's generally well documented that sort of human rights record and attitude towards those things hasn't shifted dramatically. I think there's great nuance with regards to their attitude towards cultural heritage, which is why I keep thinking this is such an opportunity. We've got to go there, and we mustn't think of them as just this monolithic black box of a government with whom we can't talk or engage. And I think cultural projects are exactly the opportunity where you can work with the grain of the context and do some good stuff, albeit on a smaller scale than your usual sort of saffron development project. But yeah.
Just pick up a couple of questions online before I come back to the room. Anthony Wynn asks two linked things. Is there any carryover from pre-Islamic practices or any nostalgia for the old days? And as a sort of footnote to that, if you like, has Islam in Nuristan changed since the arrival of the Taliban?
Good questions, and probably ones I can't answer in the kind of detail you'd like. It was strange having sort of conversations with people about pre-Islamic gods and trying to get to a point where people were sort of happy to talk about them and where they even knew very much about them, and rather respectfully perhaps it was the older members of the villages that I went to that were familiar with that pantheon of pre-Islamic gods. A couple of them had told me that this is still something that we teach to our children in the schools. They learn about these things. I don't know whether that's true or not. I take that at face value. I'd like to think it's true. But there were very many people whom I asked these questions who gave me sort of a very blank look. What has changed is that there is now a complete ban on any carving of human forms, any sculptures. All of the iconography, there's wonderful statues that I showed you before, are completely banned. There are a couple of contemporary workshops that are producing, furniture and wood carving for export to markets in Pakistan, but also to Kabul. But they're not doing, and they used to do this kind of thing, but they're no longer doing that. So there's definitely a separation between the sort of that element of the pre-Islamic belief system.
And one other question from online: where are the women?
Yeah.
Well,
were they actually allowed to watch the archery? Were they involved in any way?
Yeah, there wasn't a woman in sight as far as the archery was concerned. But in another example of why we shouldn't just look at this thing in a one-dimensional manner, in Waigal, a part of Nuristan, the women there have a sort of a greater degree of, they were out and about much more than they were in other parts of Nuristan. And in fact, even in other bits of Afghanistan that I was driving through at the time, in Kunar, in Nangarhar, and even in Kabul, the proportion of women that you would see is obviously significantly less than before, but there were people out and about, not all of them in burqas either, but really during the archery tournament, not a person, not a single woman in sight.
The other, yeah, Matthew, and then
Just a technical point. If I understood, when they were shooting their bows, they tightened the string, they took aim, and then they pulled right back and fired. As opposed to, I think, the traditional West way, we do the opposite.
Well, there was a variety of different ways of shooting, and some of them would have that last sort of final jerk of the string to release. Others shot in a way that would look very at home here, and pulling it back, holding it at an anchor point, and then releasing it. And even the draw, it's called a Mediterranean release. You have one finger above the string and two fingers below it. That's something that's very familiar to us here. It's the way that we draw it. When you're using shorter bows, where the string angle, if you like, is that much more extreme at the point at which you pulled it back, you use a thumb release because you only have a smaller bit of contact with the string. So it's very, there are all sorts of parallels you could draw with sort of archery here. I mean, we could go into details of the bow design as well if you'd like, but I suspect I'd be pushing your patience a little bit if I was to do that. But yeah.
Thanks, John. That was a brilliant talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the perception of Nuristani culture in the rest of Afghanistan and archery, and to what extent is this able to become something that the entire nation takes pride in? Because archery in Bhutan is a national sport, whereas this is very much, I suppose, limited to North, which is closed for Afghans for a very long time.
It's a really good question. It'd be hard to supplant something like buzkashi, the game played on horses with dead goats as a national sport, I suspect. I think there is an awareness, and there will be others in the audience here who could probably speak in a more informed manner about this than me, but I suspect there is an awareness of Nuristani cultural heritage, and I think the woodwork in particular is a kind of a real signal of that. It's the thing that people are probably the most familiar with and the most proud of. Whether or not they call that Nuristani or Afghan woodworking, I don't know. But it'd be wonderful. Obviously, I'd be the first person to advocate for archery becoming Afghanistan's second national sport after buzkashi, for sure.
A couple of somewhat related questions from online. First and shortest, are there similar traditions around archery elsewhere in Afghanistan? And secondly, have you done any work in Pakistan, in Chitral, where there are some non-Muslim communities of Kalasha potentially related to the Nuristanis? Have they made an effort to preserve traditional culture, and do they practice archery?
The archery in Afghanistan, I've seen in Ghazni, I've seen archery being practiced with modern bows rather than traditional ones. And they're shooting at a range of, I'd be guessing a little bit here, but sort of from here to the end of the room, 30 feet, 40 feet, at what look like small little ceramic or glass plates, which then shatter on impact. I haven't seen it elsewhere, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was practiced elsewhere. I haven't worked with the Kalasha. I obviously know about them, and the connections to Nuristan are interesting and quite complicated. I don't know whether they do archery in the sort of Kalasha communities. I haven't seen it, and they do an awful lot of cultural protection work at quite an extraordinary degree. When I was there in 2018, posters everywhere of come visit the Kalasha. They're almost in a sort of a reserve is not the right word, but there's definitely a strong theme there of cultural conservation.
And also online, Michael Fergus from Oslo, who unfortunately I can't actually put on speaker in the setup that we've got, I think, but has written in to say that he saw an archery competition between villages near Bargametal in February 1977. And that a significant authority on Nuristan, who you're probably aware of, Jonathan, Georg Morgenstern, Norwegian, apparently has a large collection of cultural artifacts from Nuristan in the National Library of Norway. should anyone want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And Morgan Stone was, I think, one of those very preeminent anthropologists. I think I'm right in saying in the 30s, if not a bit after, who was working in Nuristan, and for whom we have a lot to be grateful.
We're just coming up to the hour. Do we have other people wanting to ask Jonathan questions? Nobody else on that. Yep, gentleman here and then
You
there.
mentioned Roberts. Was he the same man that was in the rebellion in Chitral?
Question, in the siege of Chitral. I think he might have been. He was a doctor.
He's a doctor, yes.
Yeah,
He
and
was the head of the British, I think, legation.
yeah,
It was the same chap.
it was. Yeah, okay, yeah. No, he was remarkable, and he was there in 1890 and spent a year in Kamdesh. And his account is one of the very few, a small number of sort of eyewitness accounts of what pre-Islamic Nuristan was like. And it's full of the usual sort of nonsense you might expect from a book written at that time, but it's also wonderfully rich, wonderfully insightful, and well worth reading if anyone wants to read it. Yeah, can't recommend it highly enough.
Jonathan, I realise it may have been a difficult sort of question to ask, but did you get any sense of the sort of Nuristani perceptions of the Taliban takeover and current Taliban governance?
Well, that's a great question, because it corresponds to my last slide here, which I forgot to talk about, which is an image of the one of the 4 operating bases, I think, in Kamdesh, that was never captured by the Taliban. So Kamdesh was one of, and I don't know how many places there were across the country that this can be said about, but it was never captured by the Taliban. So they lay down their arms when Ghani fled, the president fled, and it was then handed over to the Taliban. So I think, as with all things, views are deeply, deeply mixed across the province. And, there were some for whom it wasn't a huge shift in attitudes. There were some for whom, yes, it was terrible, we can't listen to our music in the cars, and so on and so forth. I've been doing a lot of work with Alef at the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, and they actually work, one of the few organizations that work up in this region. And as we were helping them with their strategy, we were sort of asking people about the current context and so on. And for a lot of people, in rural areas in particular, it hasn't changed hugely in terms of sort of cultural attitudes and so on. So I think, there are definitely mixed views, there's definitely some hostility there. But I think by and large, the sense of relief is palpable wherever I went to. Thank God there's no more fighting. Let's just make the most of it and see where we get to. That was the pervading sense I got.
Two last things from online, and then I am actually going to have to close the meeting, I'm afraid. One, lady's asking for the name of the book you just mentioned. I think that must have been George Robertson's The Kafirs of the Hindu Kush.
Correct.
I have a copy that was produced rather nastily in sort of India or somewhere. I don't know whether there are better editions available, but
there's one available on 8 books right now for £2,500. First edition. I have my eye on it.
Bargain price. And one last question about the substance, as it were, is there an age threshold to learn archery in Nuristan? Do young boys take part, or is it reserved to adults and teenagers?
No, there were young children. I mean, they must have been sort of 10 or 11. You may have seen in the sort of the pictures there that were shooting them. And what's great about watching the smaller children shooting the longbows is the bows for them are what we might call traditional English longbows in terms of dimension, and they shoot them in exactly the same way that we do. They really get inside the bow, and I mean, it's wonderful to watch. So they do, and there is no age limit.
And as an absolutely last comment, Anita Christie online tells us that George Robertson's book can be downloaded as a PDF for free. So you're probably safe with the £2,500 from A books. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Jonathan, particularly, obviously, it was fantastic. I am so envious of you for having managed to get there. It's an extraordinary area. And I have read George Robertson's book, and that's a pretty amazing read as well, and pretty bloodthirsty as well. If you're sort of interested, they seem to spend most of their time going off to neighbouring villages and slaughtering each other. Fortunately, it doesn't seem to be the fashion anymore, but thank you very much for coming. It's been such a pleasure to be able to host a meeting in person for, as I said, the first time in almost 3 years. And thank you to everybody who's joined us online as well. We will be doing more of these in the next year, and you'll soon be getting a notice about that. Thank you very much.